Hello, my name's Emma and I'm the Education Officer for Westmill Sustainable Energy Trust. Thank you for choosing to use our video presentation. This first slide is really for anybody who's presenting this video. I just wanted to let you know that you can find associated documents on our website at this link. These include a lesson plan, a delivery guide. Now that will enable you to give children a little bit more detail and background and answer further questions. There's also some further points for discussion there as well. Worksheets, these can be printed off. There's a black and white version as well as a colour version, and there's also one that's fillable, so you can download it and save it and then have it filled on a laptop or tablet. And there's worksheet answers as well. On most slides that you will see that there are questions highlighted in orange. There are also some other questions that I'll ask throughout the presentation. Do please feel free to pause the presentation after any question. I'll try and leave a short gap so that children who are watching the presentation on their own have a chance to think about their answers. However, please pause it at any time that you feel it will be useful for children to deliberate or discuss their answers. There are also tasks throughout the presentation, and this is another opportunity to pause it and then give them an opportunity to fill in the worksheets that are associated with the presentation. But do please feel free to pause it at any time. So let's get started. Welcome to Lesson 2, Electricity. In this lesson we're going to explore a little bit about the history of electricity and the development of the light bulb. We're also going to look in more depth at how other types of energy are transformed into electrical energy. As with Lesson 1, there are some tasks for you to have a go at throughout the lesson, and I've also chosen some more video clips that should help you understand the topic. So let's make a start. We're going to have a quick recap into some of what you learnt in Lesson 1. We talked about energy transformation and how other types of energy can be transformed into electrical energy. But what other types of energy can electrical energy be transformed into? Well, there's thermal energy. So an example might be an electric heater. Sound energy. So that might be a radio. Light energy, well, when we switch on a light, that's electrical energy. Kinetic energy. Remember, kinetic energy is the energy of movement, so a good example of this might be an electric vehicle. And mechanical energy, so this could be something like an electric whisk or a food processor. Sometimes it's good to think about how your life would be different if you didn't have access to electricity. How do you think it would affect the way you live? Well, it would change the way you live your life. You wouldn't have access to lighting as we know it, things like appliances, TVs, computers and so on. Do you think you could cope? It might be interesting to discuss this. Well, fortunately, most of us in this country do have access to electricity. And you may have heard of two different types of current. There's AC, alternating current, and DC, direct current. I was wondering, what type of current do we use in our homes and why, do you think? Well, if you knew that, I would have been very impressed. You probably had to do a bit of research. But the type of current that we use in our homes is AC, alternating current, and this is because it loses less current as it travels through the power lines, and it's also easier to change the voltage of alternating current. Now, don't worry too much about this at this stage. These are all things we're going to look at later on in this lesson, but also in other lessons. Electric lighting has only really become commonplace in homes since the beginning of the 20th century, so that's the early 1900s. We now take electric lighting for granted and it's available at the flick of a switch. But even as recently as the 1970s, people in Great Britain lived with the threat of regular power outages or power cuts, and this was due to high oil prices at the time. It was actually quite common in those days to keep a jar of candles to hand, and I remember this as a little girl. You never knew when they were going to happen. Before electric lighting, people used other things like candles or gas and oil lamps to light their homes. Now these light sources all involve a naked flame. I wonder if you can think of some potential problems with that. Well, yes, they could cause fires or even in extreme situations, explosions. Gas lights were used to light public spaces like theatres. In fact, on the 4th of September 1887, a fire broke out during a production at the Theatre Royal in Exeter, and unfortunately and very sadly, 150 lives were taken that night. So you can see what a risk there was. Even just falling asleep with a candle going at home could have caused problems and fire. Other than light energy, what types of energy does a flame generate? Well, it generates a little heat or thermal energy. It also generates kinetic energy if you think about the movement of the flame. And to a small extent, it does generate sound energy as well. I don't think you can exaggerate how important the development of the electric light bulb was. Suddenly, here was a relatively safe, clean way of getting light for working and living by. Now, you may have heard the name Thomas Edison, and it's sometimes assumed that he was solely responsible for the development of the electric light bulb. But actually, lots of people were very involved with this invention. On this slide, you'll see we have a list of the key characters. Humphrey Davy was a British chemist who invented the electric arc light. With an arc light, a glass bulb is used to create a vacuum. Inside that vacuum there's what we call an inert gas, so this is a gas that doesn't cause a reaction. And there are also two electrodes. When electricity is applied, a bright electrical discharge jumps between the two metal electrodes, and this is called the arc. Frederick Desmoulins was a British inventor, and he was the first to patent the incandescent light bulb. Now, a patent is a legal recognition of the design. And the incandescent light bulb is something you would recognise and that we still use today. In an incandescent light bulb, the light is actually produced by heating a metallic filament, and this radiates light. Now, initially the filaments were made of carbon, but consequently they were made of something called tungsten, and that's what they're still made of to this day, and they're more efficient and the light it radiates is stronger. They've been popular for so long because of the quality of the light, but also because they're relatively inexpensive to produce. You may have noticed that in recent years the sort of multi-filament aesthetic, like the one you can see on the slide here, have become increasingly popular again, and this is a little bit more like the original ones might have looked. Now, Joseph Swan is a name you might recognise. He was also British and was a physicist. He developed the idea of the incandescent bulb and was able to patent his own bulb designs. So then it was only in 1880, after the first three, that Thomas Edison, the name we probably associate most with the light bulb, patented a commercially viable incandescent bulb design. He used a carbon filament and was able to design a bulb that could actually last for around 600 hours. Now you can imagine what a revelation that was when people were used to using candles. So let's have a quick recap by looking at Task 1, Fill in the gaps. If you'd like to press pause to allow time to complete Task 1 on the worksheet, do so now. You can then press play to continue watching the presentation. Using the words in the list below, fill in the gaps in the following sentences. In 1880, Thomas Edison patented an incandescent light bulb. This had been a long journey of invention, starting with Humphrey Davy's arc light almost 80 years before. By the early 1900s, electric lighting was commonplace in homes. Before that, homeowners had to use other light sources like candles and gas or oil lamps. These also released a small amount of heat energy as well as light energy. The problem was that these sources used a naked flame, which sometimes resulted in fires and explosions. This was a particular problem in public places like theatres, where gas lights were used to light the front of the stage. How did you get on? In Lesson 1, we introduced the fact that there are two types of electrical energy source: renewable and non-renewable. Renewable sources include wind, solar, hydro, geothermal and biomass, and we're going to look at these in much more detail later on. Non-renewable sources include crude oil, coal and natural gas. Renewable sources are so called because they are sustainable and can be used over and over again without depletion. In other words, we do not lose them. In contrast, non-renewable sources are what we call finite. In other words, they will ultimately run out. They have taken thousands of years to develop. And even if some are still relatively plentiful, they won't last forever. Non-renewable sources or fuels like coal, crude oil and natural gas are often known by a collective term. Do you know what this is? They are known as fossil fuels and have been formed over thousands of years. You may also have heard of nuclear energy, as it has been in the news a lot recently as a potential sustainable form of energy. Is nuclear energy renewable or non-renewable? It is actually non-renewable, as it relies on the mining of uranium, which is a resource found in the Earth's crust. However, uranium, whilst finite, is still a relatively abundant resource, which is why some people are looking to it as a form of potential sustainable energy. Having said this, not everybody agrees, as there are other issues with the sustainability of nuclear, and we're going to look at that in more detail later on. So, we now know that some non-renewable sources, such as coal, crude oil and gas, are also known as fossil fuels. But why is this term used? Fossil fuels are actually made up of compressed, fossilised organic and plant matter. And like we said, this has taken thousands of years to happen with a combination of heat and pressure. And these fossil fuels aren't just used to generate electricity, they're also used to make some of the products we use every day, including things like plastics, fibres and fabrics, and cosmetics. It's strange to think, but oil-based cosmetics include things like lipsticks and lotions, perfumes and Vaseline, things that some of us use every day. So, what type of energy do fossil fuels contain? Fossil fuels contain chemical potential energy. When we think of fossil fuels, we often think of coal. Now, coal is extracted, and this is called mining, and it's done in two distinct ways. The first way that's used is something called surface mining, and this is done in big quarries like the one in the picture, where heavy machinery and explosives are used to remove the coal. The other method is something called pit mining, which is done underground using a network of tunnels and shafts. Both methods are pretty dirty and potentially dangerous processes. Pit mining, as a method for extracting coal, has been used for hundreds of years. It's interesting to imagine what it might have been like being a pit miner before the invention of the battery or electric lighting. In those days they used to have to use gas lamps, and these were very dangerous. They could cause fires and they also let off fumes. The miners, and this sometimes included children and in some cases whole families, spent long hours down the pits in the winter months and often didn't see the light of day. So, as well as physical injury from the hard labour, all the miners used to have vitamin deficiencies from the lack of sunlight and sadly also were prone to things like lung disease and breathing problems. so you can imagine it was a really hard life. So coal has always been a really valuable form of fuel, but you can imagine with the advent of electricity how much more so it became. To transform the chemical potential energy in coal into electrical energy, it has to be crushed and then it's burned, which heats water, and this creates steam. Now, it's actually the steam that drives a turbine, which in turn drives a generator. The electrical energy generated then goes through a transformer and into the grid. And the grid is the name that we use for the network of cables that feeds the electricity into our homes. So nowadays, how do we actually use coal at home? Well, the truth is many of us don't. And actually it's generally being discouraged, as coal, when it's burned, does let off fumes that are bad for the environment. However, some of us may still use slightly cleaner forms in domestic fires and multi-fuel stoves, and also many of us will have used coal on the barbecue. Crude oil is actually so valuable it's been called black gold. Oil reserves can be found below the Earth's crust, on land and at sea, and such is its value that access to these oil reserves has caused huge conflicts throughout history. To extract oil, wells have to be drilled, and then the oil has to be pumped to the surface. These are expensive processes and require a lot of machinery. So before this is done, surveys are completed to ensure they're pretty sure that there is oil where they're looking. Now, when it is extracted, like coal, it can be burned to create steam to generate electrical energy. However, crude oil is also used as the base for many fuels and other products, including, as we've said, plastics. And for it to be used in this way, contaminants in the crude oil need to be removed. This is done at a refinery. So thinking about that, how do you think crude oil is transformed into mechanical energy, say for a car? Well, first it is refined to make petroleum, which we use in combustion engines in our cars. Now, combustion means igniting or setting fire to. So think about the word ignition in our cars. When we turn the ignition in our cars, the spark plug ignites or sets fire to the fuel. Now this sounds scary, but it's done in a very controlled way. Once the engine's running, it goes through a cycle: intake, compression, combustion and exhaust. A cylinder fills with a combination of fuel and air, and then a piston moves to compress this fuel and air. When it's compressed as far as it can go, the spark from the spark plug then ignites or sets fire to the fuel. So this is the combustion bit. There's a controlled explosion within the cylinder, and that then forces the piston back down again. A valve opens and then the piston pushes the hot air that's been burned out. Now inside the engine there is a part called the crankshaft, and this is actually connected to the piston. So then, as the piston moves, it moves the crankshaft, which in turn moves the other working parts, which move the vehicle. It's a complicated but effective process. We start with chemical potential energy, which is transformed into thermal energy, which is transformed into mechanical energy, and ultimately, if the car moves, we've got kinetic energy too. Like crude oil, natural gas is found deep underground in pores in sedimentary rock. Also, like crude oil, wells have to be drilled to extract it. But in recent years, developments in methods of natural gas extraction, things like fracturing or fracking as we call it, have caused controversy, as the drilling required can cause tremors like low-level earthquakes. So you may have heard about it recently in the news. Once it's extracted, it's usually sent through pipelines for processing, and it's used in a very similar way to coal and crude oil to generate electricity. So aside from electrical energy, what other types of energy do we use processed natural gas for in our homes? Well, most commonly it's thermal energy. So many of us will have gas boilers for gas heating systems. Some people will also have gas cookers. Interestingly, it can also be used as a fuel for vehicles, though is much less common than petrol. So, thinking about what we've learned about fossil fuels, let's have a quick go at Task 2, Fuel Match. Once again, if you'd like to, you can press pause to allow time to complete the task, and then press play to continue. So we need to match the different fossil fuels listed at the top with the different products in the middle and the different extraction methods at the bottom. So the first one, natural gas, well, there's a little gas canister in the bottom of that burner. And how is it extracted? By fracking. That's one of the methods. Second one, coal, is used in a barbecue and it's extracted by mining. Finally, crude oil is used in many plastics and is extracted by drilling wells. Well done.
Fossil fuels. Fossil fuel is a term used to describe a group of energy sources that were formed from ancient plants and organisms during the Carboniferous period approximately 360 to 286 million years ago, even before the age of dinosaurs. At that time, the land was covered with swamps filled with organisms and plants. As they died, they sank to the bottom of swamps and oceans and over millions of years started decomposing under layers of sand, clay, and other minerals. Different types of fossil fuels formed depending on the combination of organic matter, temperature, time, and pressure conditions while decomposing. There are three major types of fossil fuels: coal, oil, and natural gas. Coal was formed from ferns, plants, and trees, which hardened due to pressure and heat. Oil was formed from small organisms like zooplankton and algae, where pressure caused the more complex organic matter to decompose. Natural gas was formed by the same process as oil, only it was exposed to more heat and pressure, causing it to further decompose and turn into a gaseous form. Fossil fuels are sought-after energy sources because they have a high energy density. They are the world's dominant energy source. Fossil fuels have a variety of applications from electricity production to transport fuels. They can also be used to make a variety of common products, from plastics to cosmetics to even some medicines. These resources have powered industrialization over history and continue to do so today. Fossil fuels can be an abundant and cheap, or in some cases, a scarce and expensive form of energy, depending on geographic location. For this reason, geopolitical issues arise due to scarcity caused by the natural geographic allocation of these highly valuable resources. Fossil fuels are considered non-renewable resources because they take millions of years to form, which means that once they are used, the resources will not be replenished in a human lifetime. The gradual depletion of the most accessible fossil fuel reserves have forced companies to develop technologies for extracting more challenging or unconventional reserves. In many cases, this means additional safety and environmental concerns as well as higher costs. Fossil fuels are also the largest emitters of carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas which causes climate change. In addition, their production causes both environmental and human health issues. These concerns have triggered society to look at alternate sources of energy that are more environmentally sustainable and renewable. That's fossil fuels.
So I hope that was a useful and interesting video. Towards the end, she mentioned the problems with fossil fuels. We've touched on this a little bit. Firstly, that they're non-renewable or finite, so they will ultimately run out. We've also talked a little bit about processing and obtaining fossil fuels and the way they're extracted, but we haven't talked in much detail about the environmental damage this can do. If you think about it, drilling, digging, extracting, using explosives, even clearing land to build refineries, all these things can do massive environmental damage. Then there's the problem with burning fossil fuels, which causes pollution, and this releases the carbon stored inside. So, what problems are caused by the release of carbon dioxide or CO2 into the atmosphere? Well, as you will know, this is one of the big issues of our day. The release of CO2 into the atmosphere causes what is known as the greenhouse effect, which is where heat is able to get in but not out of our atmosphere. So this has raised the average temperature of the Earth, and that in turn has caused changes including things like melting of the ice caps and a rise in sea levels. This is a good stage to look at nuclear energy. And whilst it isn't a fossil fuel, nuclear energy is thought of as non-renewable. However, this is an interesting one because nuclear energy itself is actually renewable, but it's the materials used in the process that are non-renewable. To release nuclear or atomic energy, a uranium atom has to be split using a nuclear reactor. I wonder if you know what this process of splitting uranium atoms is called. It's called fission, F-I-S-S-I-O-N. The reaction to fission creates radiation, and this is used to heat water. Just like other methods, again, the heat creates steam, and the steam drives turbines which generate electricity. It sounds very straightforward, but there are potential issues. The fact that the reaction creates radiation is because uranium is naturally radioactive. There are different levels of radioactivity, but exposure to radioactivity can be very dangerous. Nuclear energy is sometimes known as low carbon. However, this is because it's less obviously polluting than other sources, and the greenhouse gases are emitted throughout the life cycle of a nuclear reactor, during construction, operation, and the production of the fuel when the plant is dismantled at the end, and any waste materials that are disposed of, so may not be as noticeable initially. That is to say that whilst it is definitely lower carbon than fossil fuels, processes involved do still produce CO2. There's also the issue of the uranium. Where does uranium come from? So uranium is mined from rock in the Earth's crust. That means it's non-renewable, and although it has been relatively abundant, we're using it at a high rate, so it will ultimately run out. So then, having looked at a range of non-renewable sources, why should we choose renewables? Well, the key thing with renewables is that they are much more sustainable. But what does sustainable mean? For something to be sustainable, it must be able to be maintained at a level that doesn't use up the world's resources or cause damage. In something called the Brundtland Report, written in 1987, there's a really good definition of sustainable development. It says, "Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs." In other words, if we're greedy and use up all our resources now, we leave future generations with little else. So to be sustainable, we need to ensure that is not our approach. Another good aspect of renewable energy is that it's cleaner in terms of its installation and use, and also far less polluting than fossil fuels. Now, it's important to say here that different types of renewable energy have different levels of pollution, but overall are far less polluting, and some cause little or no pollution. The really good news is that a couple of years ago, in 2019, renewables provided roughly a third of the electricity generated in the UK. The even better news is that this is really growing at the moment. I wonder if you know if your energy supplier uses renewable energy. Well, you may or may not know this, but you can often find out by going to their website. It's interesting, though, that there are now suppliers who supply electricity from 100% renewable energy sources, a step in the right direction. Just a quick note here, I did mention just now that whilst renewable renewables may be called clean, they may still cause some pollution. Let me clarify. This pollution is usually caused by their manufacture, transport or installation. However, in many cases, this is offset by the clean energy they produce during their lifetime. In other words, it is cancelled out, and this is something we're going to look at in more depth in future lessons. It's also important to note that in the long term, engineers and manufacturers are continually looking at ways of making the manufacturing and transportation processes cleaner.
Around the world, renewable energy use is on the rise, and these alternative energy sources could hold the key to combating climate change. What is renewable energy? Renewable energy is generated from sources that naturally replenish themselves and never run out. The most common sources are solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, and biomass. Over 80% of the total energy consumed by humans is derived from fossil fuels. However, renewables are the fastest growing source of energy in the world. Renewable energy has many benefits. First, it can combat climate change because it creates no direct greenhouse gas emissions. The only emissions that they produce are indirect, meaning those that result from manufacturing parts, installation, operation, and maintenance. But even those are minimal. Second, renewable energy can decrease pollution and therefore reduce threats to our health. Wind, solar, and hydroelectric systems create no air pollution emissions, and geothermal and biomass energy systems emissions are much lower than non-renewable energy sources. Third, renewable energy is a reliable source of power. Because renewable energy sources are, well, renewable, they will never run out. Once built, renewable facilities cost very little to operate, and the fuel is often free. As a result, renewable energy prices tend to be stable over time. While renewable energy has many advantages, it is not without downsides. It is difficult for renewable energy sources to generate power on the same large scale as fossil fuels. Building wind farms and dams can disrupt wildlife and migration patterns and lead to ecological destruction. Both solar and wind energy are intermittent. They only generate power while the sun is shining or while the wind is blowing. Batteries can store excess energy for later use. However, they are often costly. While renewable energy presents some challenges, it also offers an environmentally friendly alternative to the greenhouse gas emissions and pollution of fossil fuels. And as advances in technology make renewable energy more accessible, affordable, and efficient, an end to climate change could be within our reach.
I think that was a really useful video, and it's interesting to note that some of the things she mentioned towards the end about advancements in technology and efficiency, these have already happened and are still happening. So there's been a lot of work on the efficiency of turbines and solar panels, and also advancements in battery storage. Over the next few slides, we're going to get an overview of different types of renewable energy. So let's start with wind, which is a form of natural kinetic energy. Remember kinetic energy, which is the energy of movement. So the movement of the wind causes the blades of the turbine to rotate, generating mechanical energy. After this, a generator inside the turbine transforms this into electrical energy. Now it's renewable because by using this we don't use up the wind, and sustainable because we can keep using it without fear of doing so. So where might you find wind turbines? Nowadays you find turbines both on land, these are called onshore, and also at sea, offshore. The onshore wind farms are usually built on high ground or open ground to take advantage of the wind. Solar energy can be used to generate electricity, but it's also used for thermal energy too. Within solar panels are photovoltaic cells, and these are used to convert the light energy into electric current. Now, I'm not going to talk about that too much now, as we're going to look at it in much more depth in later lessons. Around the world, solar power is the fastest growing source of renewable energy. Now, in the UK, which direction do you think solar panels need to face to capture the most sunlight? Well, in the UK, they should all be facing south. But does this apply to all countries? No, it doesn't. For example, in the southern hemisphere countries, panels should be facing north. Like wind power, hydropower has been used since ancient times to grind flour and provide mechanical energy for other tasks. The flow and strength of running, moving or falling water is harnessed to generate power, and sources include rivers and streams and man-made systems like dams. Sea tides are also used, but this is slightly different and it's referred to as tidal power. So, also like wind power, a turbine is used to generate mechanical energy. But instead of wind, it's the pressure of the water that moves the turbine. The kind of electrical energy produced is called hydroelectricity. I wonder if you know what the name is that's used for a man-made lake that's held back by a dam. It's known as a reservoir, and this comes from the French word réserver, which means to reserve or to keep. So we're keeping or reserving water. So historically, geothermal energy use has been limited to areas where there's evidence of natural reserves near the Earth's surface. Now, these are often found near the point where tectonic plates meet. And tectonic plates are kind of like the outer shell of the Earth. And there are many of them, and they don't all join up. They move very slightly, and the gaps between them can release geothermal energy. Unfortunately, to reach these gaps or reserves, holes have to be drilled. And when drilled, geothermal wells release greenhouse gases trapped inside. However, these emissions are much lower than those released by the extraction and use of fossil fuels. Geothermal energy has been used for thousands of years. In fact, the Romans used geothermal energy to heat their baths. It can be used in domestic heating, and once again, the steam can also be used to drive turbines to generate electricity. Now, I wonder if you can think of any places in the UK where there are natural hot springs. Well, a good clue is it's often towns or cities with the word spa or bath in the title. So an obvious one is Bath in Somerset, which has natural hot springs. However, there are also warm springs in other places including Buxton and Matlock, Bristol, and also near Cardiff in Wales. I wonder if you've heard of biomass. If you have, it might have been having seen biomass heat logs, and these are now often available for sale in supermarkets. So biomass is organic material, and it can be made from crops which are grown specially, but often it's the byproduct of industry, and it utilises a resource that would otherwise be wasted. So I wonder if you know what the term byproduct means. A byproduct is a material that's left over after the processing of a product, material or food. For example, wood chip left over from the conversion of trees into timber, or wool, which is a byproduct of the farming industry for food. So, byproducts like wood chip and waste from timber industry are often used as biomass. So, biomass can be burned for heat and fuel at home, like those heat logs, or on an industrial scale. But do you think there are any disadvantages to burning biomass? Well, although it's better than burning fossil fuels, biomass does still release some CO2, so it's not quite as clean as other renewables. Wind and solar are now the most common forms of renewable energy in the UK, and I think the chances are quite high that you are aware of local renewables. There could be a wind farm or a solar park near you. At Westmill near Shrivenham in Oxfordshire, we have both types, wind and solar. The site is an arable farm and it's high and flat and open, so ideal for wind farms, and we have 5 wind turbines and over 20,000 photovoltaic solar panels. I wonder, how many homes do you think benefit from the power we generate at Westmill? Well, it might just be a guess, but let's see who's closest. The solar park generates enough electricity to supply around about 1,500 average homes, and the wind farm generates enough electricity to supply approximately 3,000, so that's a total of 4,500. So let's have a recap of renewable energy sources by completing task 3. Pause to complete the task and press play to continue watching the presentation. Identify the types of renewable energy from the sources pictured below and describe how the sources are harnessed. So don't worry if your wording is slightly different from these, this is just to give you an idea of the sort of answers you might have. The first one's been done, but let's take a look at it anyway. So biomass is organic material. It can be made from a crop grown specially or a byproduct of another industry like wood chip. It can be made into pellets and burned to generate heat and electrical energy. Geothermal energy is natural heat energy stored under the Earth's crust. The steam is used for domestic heating and to drive turbines to generate electricity. Hydropower harnesses the kinetic energy of running water or the gravitational energy of falling water. The force of the water turns a turbine to generate mechanical energy. Solar power is the conversion of energy from the sun into electricity. Photovoltaic cells are used to convert light into electric current. And finally, wind power comes from the natural kinetic energy of the wind. Wind turbines are used to generate mechanical energy, which turns a generator, transforming it into electrical energy. Well done. It's really important to look to the future, to keep things moving forward, but also to recognise that we have made some progress already. It's only 20 years ago that almost all of our electricity came from non-renewables like coal and gas. But now we have a target, and that is to have switched to clean energy by 2050. An act called the Climate Change Act commits the UK government by law to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 100% of 1990 levels to net zero by 2050. However, the sooner we can bring our CO2 emissions down, the better. So targets like this means that the renewable energy sector is really exciting and it's growing fast. I wonder what types of jobs you think are available to you in the renewable energy sector. Well, this is the really exciting thing because it's a broad range of jobs in areas from science and engineering to design, marketing, programming, construction, ecology, farming and development and all sorts. It's really fast growing. In the meantime, we can look at how we can help bring CO2 levels down more quickly. We're going to be looking at this in much more depth in lesson 6, but we can do all sorts of small things that make a big difference, starting by little things like turning off lights and appliances, choosing rechargeable as opposed to single-use batteries, or using low-energy light bulbs. Things like choosing not to buy what we now call fast fashion, reducing food miles, following the 6 R's, which you'll come to again, but these are recycling, reusing, rethinking, refusing, reducing and repairing. In fact, there are other R's as well, and things like reducing air miles, car sharing, cycling to school or work, walking more. There's lots of action that we can take right now.
In the UK, we have pioneered an ambitious approach to tackling climate change, backed by strong legislation. It's 10 years since that legislation, the Climate Change Act, became law, supported by a huge majority in Parliament. The Act places a legal requirement on the government to dramatically reduce the UK's greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. It must also prepare the UK for the effects of climate change, like worsening heat waves, drought, and flooding. To help achieve these targets, the Committee on Climate Change was created, an organisation independent of government that advises and reports to Parliament each year. So far, the UK has done well, with a 43% fall in emissions since 1990. Much of this progress has come from new ways of generating electricity. Coal-fired power plants are being closed, as more electricity is produced without burning fossil fuels. Last year, for the first time, the majority of the UK's electricity came from renewable or low-carbon sources. The cost of renewable electricity, particularly offshore wind, has dropped dramatically, thanks in part to the committee's call for fundamental reform of the market. To help prepare for climate change, more investment is being put into flood defences, water consumption is falling, and electricity and water companies are protecting their infrastructure. But more needs to be done, and challenges remain. Emissions from our transport system, our buildings and industry are not falling fast enough. We still need to reduce emissions from the way we use our land and eliminate emissions from the waste we produce. Further action is needed to protect new homes from heat and flooding and to improve the natural environment. In 2015, countries around the world agreed to try and limit global warming to well below 2 degrees C. It was a landmark moment, and in early 2019, the Committee on Climate Change will advise government on how the Paris Agreement should be translated into new long-term emissions targets for the UK. Guided by the Climate Change Act, the decade to come will be critical in cementing the UK's role in the global effort to tackle climate change.
Now, whilst that video does talk about the Climate Change Committee and discuss some of the goals that we're working towards, the sharp-eyed amongst you will have noticed it was made in 2018. So we've actually made some more progress since then, and some more targets have been set. It might be interesting to look into what those targets are and also find out about some of the environmental progress we made in the area of renewables during last year, 2020. It's always really positive to hear about progress, but we should also always remember we need to keep moving forward towards these targets. So, what have you learnt this lesson? In 1880, who patented a commercially viable incandescent bulb? Now, the key phrase there is commercially viable. So that was Thomas Edison. But remember, there were other people heavily involved in the development of that invention. What do we call the two types of source of electrical energy? Well, it's non-renewable and renewable. Coal and crude oil are also known as something fuels. That's right, it's fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are finite resources. What does this mean? It means that they are not renewable. They won't last forever and will ultimately run out. Can you name the sources of renewable energy that we looked at? The ones that we looked at were wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, and also biomass. And finally, where can you find two of these sources located together? There's actually a clue on the slide. Well, it's with us at Westmill, in Watchfield near Shrivenham, near Swindon in Oxfordshire. And we really hope one day to welcome you there to come and see our wind farm and solar park. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed lesson 2 and look forward to seeing you in lesson 3.